What if the most powerful weapons ever built weren't meant to defend humanity, but to erase it? What if entire worlds, entire bloodlines, and even loyal soldiers could vanish, not from war, but because an empire decided they were a threat? This is the story of the Imperium, and the brutal superweapons it used to kill its own. What if the most terrifying weapons ever created were not aimed at enemies beyond the borders, but at the very people they claimed to protect? The Imperium was built on a promise. A promise whispered into the ears of terrified worlds and etched into the laws of countless systems: we will keep you safe. For millennia, that promise was repeated until it became indistinguishable from truth. The Imperium stood as a colossus of order in a hostile universe, surrounded by threats real and imagined, and it taught its people one simple belief: that survival itself was proof of righteousness. Every towering fleet, every planet-shattering device, every secret project hidden behind layers of classification was said to exist for one reason only: protection. Citizens were raised to see the Imperium as a shield, a final bulwark against extinction. From the moment a child could understand language, they were taught that chaos was humanity's natural enemy, and that without absolute control, civilization would tear itself apart. The Imperium did not rule through fear, the stories said; it ruled through necessity. There were monsters in the dark, ancient forces waiting to devour mankind, and only overwhelming power could hold them back. To question that power was not just disloyal, it was dangerous. The superweapons came to symbolize that promise. They were spoken of in reverent tones, half myth and half miracle. Weapons capable of cracking planets, sterilizing stars, silencing entire regions of space, tools so devastating they were never meant to be used lightly. Or so the people were told. Their existence alone was supposed to be enough. Deterrence, the Imperium called it. Peace through the certainty of annihilation. As long as these weapons slept, the Imperium endured, and as long as the Imperium endured, humanity survived. But there was always a contradiction buried beneath the speeches and ceremonies. A quiet, uncomfortable question no one was encouraged to ask. If these weapons were built to defend humanity, why were they so often tested far from any battlefield? Why did entire populations vanish without invasion, without warning, without even an official enemy to blame? Why did some planets simply stop sending transmissions, only to be quietly reclassified months later as uninhabited, or lost to environmental collapse? Official explanations were always ready. Industrial accidents, warp anomalies, natural disasters. The universe was dangerous, after all. Tragic losses were inevitable, and the Imperium mourned, publicly, solemnly, briefly, before moving on. Memorials were raised, names were recorded, then, slowly, references faded. Data archives were amended, records grew vague. Within a generation, most citizens could no longer remember what had been lost, only that it had been unfortunate and unavoidable. Yet beneath the polished surface of order, rumors persisted. Whispers passed between navigators, archivists, and soldiers who had seen too much. They spoke of worlds declared non-compliant, without ever declaring rebellion. Of census records that dropped by billions overnight. Of commands issued in absolute secrecy, authorizing actions no one was meant to acknowledge afterward. These were not tales of foreign enemies or alien invasions. These were stories of something far more unsettling: the Imperium acting against itself. At the heart of imperial doctrine lay an unspoken assumption: the greatest threat to order was not external, it was internal. The Imperium feared fragmentation more than annihilation, dissent more than invasion. Unity was not a moral ideal, it was a survival requirement. Anything that endangered cohesion, ideas, movements, cultures, even statistical probabilities, was treated as a pathogen. And like any pathogen, it was not debated with. It was eliminated. This was the truth hidden behind the banners and parades. The Imperium did not simply defend humanity from destruction. It defined what humanity was allowed to be. Loyalty was not a virtue, it was a baseline expectation. Obedience was not rewarded, it was assumed. And safety was conditional, granted only to those who fit within the narrow parameters of acceptable existence. The superweapons were never just weapons. They were instruments of correction, of enforcement, of final judgment. They existed not merely to end wars, but to prevent futures the Imperium found unacceptable. And long before the First World was erased from history, long before the first population vanished without a trace, the decision had already been made. If humanity itself ever became a threat to the Imperium's control, then humanity would be the target. Why would an empire that claimed to fear extinction spend so much effort perfecting the art of disappearance? The Imperium never announced its internal wars. There were no declarations, no rallying cries, no visible enemies to unite against. Instead, there was silence, carefully managed, meticulously enforced. Entire operations unfolded beyond public awareness, buried beneath layers of classification so deep that even high-ranking officials only saw fragments. To the average citizen, the Imperium appeared calm, stable, eternal. Nothing ever seemed to change. And that, more than anything, was the point. Within the Imperium's vast bureaucratic machinery existed a category that was never spoken aloud outside sealed chambers: internal threats. These were not rebels with banners or fleets amassing at the border. They were trends, ideas, behaviors, and probabilities. A population that questioned too often. A culture that resisted assimilation. A region whose productivity declined just enough to suggest dissatisfaction. None of these were crimes. Not yet, but the Imperium did not wait for crimes. It planned for outcomes. Every world was monitored, not just for compliance, but for deviation. Loyalty metrics were tracked with obsessive precision. Communication patterns, cultural expressions, educational shifts, everything was quantified, analyzed, predicted. The Imperium did not ask if unrest would occur. It asked when, and more importantly, how costly it would be to allow it to happen. When the projected cost exceeded tolerance thresholds, a world was quietly flagged. No alarms sounded, no citizens were informed. The designation was bureaucratic, clinical, and devastating. From that moment on, the population was no longer viewed as people, but as a liability. A potential fracture in the perfect image of unity the Imperium depended on to survive. The first response was always subtle. Administrators were replaced, supplies were rerouted, communications slowed, information was filtered, then rewritten. Education systems were adjusted to emphasize obedience over curiosity. For most worlds, this was enough. Compliance could be restored without bloodshed, and the Imperium would congratulate itself on another crisis averted. But sometimes, control could not be reasserted without force. Sometimes, the population did not bend fast enough. That was when the superweapons entered the equation. Officially, these weapons did not exist for internal use. Their stated purpose was defense against existential threats, xenos incursions, cosmic anomalies, enemies capable of wiping out humanity entirely. Their deployment protocols reflected this fiction. Authorization required extreme circumstances, unanimous consent from shadow councils, and layers of justification so dense they appeared impossible to satisfy. On paper, using such weapons against Imperial citizens was unthinkable. In practice, the rules were written by the same authority that broke them. When a world was deemed irrecoverable, the language changed. Citizens became assets. Assets became risks. Risks became equations. And equations, once solved, demanded implementation. The decision to deploy a superweapon was never framed as punishment. It was framed as prevention. A necessary excision to protect the greater body of the Imperium from infection. Those who authorized these actions rarely saw themselves as villains. They believed they were custodians of survival, burdened with choices too terrible for ordinary minds to bear. Billions might die, yes, but trillions would live. History would never judge them, because history itself would be rewritten. No one would remember the names of the lost, and therefore no guild would remain. This was the Imperium's greatest trick. It did not simply destroy worlds. It destroyed the context that made those worlds meaningful. Once a superweapon was used, the aftermath was not chaos or mourning, but administrative calm. Records were adjusted, trade routes rerouted, star charts updated. A planet that had housed generations of human life was reclassified with a single line of text. Uninhabited, quarantined, decommissioned, and the people who had lived there, who had loved, struggled, believed, were reduced to statistical noise. To the wider Imperium, nothing had happened. No war had been fought. No tragedy had occurred. Life continued uninterrupted, which only reinforced the belief that the Imperium was benevolent, stable, and necessary. The absence of visible violence became proof of moral superiority. After all, how could an empire that never seemed to fight itself be capable of such brutality? But beneath that illusion lay a truth far more disturbing than open tyranny. The Imperium did not need spectacle. It did not need terrorized crowds or public executions. It ruled through absence, through the quiet removal of anything that threatened to remind humanity it could exist outside Imperial control. And once that mechanism was perfected, once the Imperium learned how to erase its own people without leaving scars, there was no turning back. What happens when annihilation becomes not a last resort, but a routine administrative solution? The first true internal deployment of a superweapon did not come with panic or urgency. It arrived as a memo, cold, precise, and buried within layers of authorization codes. To those who approved it, the decision felt inevitable, even overdue. The world in question had not rebelled. It had not fired a single shot. Its crime was subtler and far more dangerous. It had failed to become what the Imperium required. For generations, the planet had maintained its own traditions, its own interpretations of loyalty, its own identity. Productivity targets were met, taxes were paid, recruits were supplied. On the surface, it was a model world. But beneath the metrics, the data told a different story. Cultural cohesion was strengthening independently of imperial doctrine. Local narratives were beginning to eclipse centralized history. The population did not hate the Imperium, but it no longer needed it to define itself. That was enough. The weapon chosen was not designed for war in any conventional sense. It did not deploy armies or missiles. It did not require invasion fleets or prolonged campaigns. It was a system built to do one thing perfectly: cleanse a world so thoroughly that nothing recognizably human could survive, not conquer, not occupy, erase. Activation took minutes. There was no warning broadcast, no final ultimatum. The Imperium did not believe in dramatic gestures. From orbit, the planet looked peaceful as ever. Cities glowed softly against the darkness, unaware that their fate had already been sealed. When the weapon engaged, the process was almost elegant. Atmospheric ignition cascaded across the globe, oceans boiled into superheated vapor, and tectonic plates fractured under stresses they were never meant to endure. Within hours, the planet was silent. No ruins remained for future archaeologists. No frozen corpses or shattered monuments. The surface was scoured down to lifeless stone, stripped of every biological trace. Even microbial life was annihilated, leaving behind a world so sterile it might never host life again. From a distance, it appeared untouched, just another barren sphere in a galaxy full of them. The Imperium called it a containment success. There were no survivors to question what had happened. No refugees to spread stories. No evidence to contradict the official narrative. When the planet was removed from active census records, only a handful of administrators noticed, and they were bound by oaths, contracts, and fear. Trade routes were adjusted, star charts updated. Within a decade, few remembered the world had ever been inhabited at all. This was the brilliance of the weapon. It did not create martyrs. It did not inspire resistance. It left no scars for future generations to rally around. By eliminating not just life, but memory, the Imperium ensured that the act itself could never become a symbol. There would be no cautionary tales whispered in dark corners. No forbidden histories to rediscover. The world had not fallen. It had simply ceased to matter. Internally, the success of the operation reshaped doctrine. What had once been considered unthinkable was now proven effective. Clean, final, efficient. The weapon had solved a problem permanently, and without destabilizing the surrounding systems. No unrest followed, no protests erupted. The Imperium had removed billions of its own citizens, and the galaxy barely noticed. That realization changed everything. From that moment on, superweapons were no longer viewed as catastrophic fail-safes. They became tools, reserved, certainly, but available. Options on a strategic table. The threshold for their use lowered, not because the Imperium grew more cruel, but because it grew more confident. It had learned that it could kill on an unimaginable scale without consequence. The lesson was simple and terrifying: annihilation worked. And once an empire understands that it can erase its own people without collapsing, the definition of necessary begins to expand. What if the Imperium discovered a way to destroy rebellion without killing the body at all? Fire was effective, but it was not subtle. A lifeless planet could be hidden, but it could not contribute. Resources were lost, strategic positions abandoned. As the Imperium expanded, it began to seek something more refined, methods of control that preserved infrastructure while eliminating the true source of instability. Not people, ideas. The next generation of superweapons did not scorch worlds or fracture crusts. They left cities standing, oceans calm, and skies unchanged. To an outside observer, nothing appeared wrong. Trade continued, messages were sent. The Imperium could point to these worlds as proof of benevolent governance. And yet, something fundamental had been removed. The weapon targeted cognition itself. When it was first deployed, even its designers did not fully understand the depth of its effects. It operated through fields that interacted directly with neural patterns, selectively destabilizing the structures responsible for memory formation, emotional association, and abstract reasoning. It did not wipe minds clean. It edited them. Precision was the goal. Chaos was unacceptable. Across entire populations, memories began to unravel. Not all at once, and not uniformly. History vanished first. Shared stories, cultural myths, collective experiences that bound people together. Then language began to degrade. Nuance disappeared. Words that described resistance, independence, or identity lost their meaning, then their usage, then their existence. Families remained intact, but the emotional weight of connection dulled. Love persisted as habit, not conviction. People noticed something was wrong. They felt the absence before they understood it. Conversations grew shorter. Creativity declined. Curiosity became rare, then uncomfortable. When citizens attempted to articulate their unease, they found themselves lacking the words to do so. The Imperium called this phase stabilization. There was no visible violence. No mass graves. No screams echoing through the void. Instead, compliance deepened naturally. Questions stopped forming. Dissent became psychologically exhausting. The population did not resist because resistance required a sense of self that no longer fully existed. Administratively, the results were extraordinary. Productivity increased. Crime rates fell. Political deviation dropped to near zero. Entire worlds transitioned into perfect obedience without a single casualty recorded. From a bureaucratic standpoint, it was a triumph. From a moral one, it was something far worse than slaughter. Survivors of these deployments were still alive, but they were no longer whole. Generations later, their descendants inherited the damage. Cultural voids persisted, passed down as emptiness rather than memory. These worlds produced loyal citizens who never asked why loyalty mattered. They did not dream of alternatives because the concept of alternative had been quietly removed from their minds. The Imperium preferred these weapons. They were cleaner, reversible, in theory, though no reversal was ever authorized. Most importantly, they left no evidence of atrocity. If anyone accused the Imperium of wrongdoing, the living proof stood before them: thriving cities, stable populations, smiling citizens who could not imagine wanting anything else. This was control perfected, not through terror, but through erasure of the very faculties that made terror meaningful. And yet, even these weapons had limits. Some individuals resisted longer than others. Fragments of memory persisted. Instinctive discomfort lingered in dreams. In rare cases, entire groups began to display anomalies, subtle signs of re-emerging identity. To the Imperium, this was not failure. It was a diagnostic, because if ideas could survive mind-breaking weapons, then something even more decisive would be required. What loyalty can exist when even obedience becomes a liability? For centuries, the Imperium taught its soldiers that service was the highest form of purpose. To wear its colors was to be elevated above ordinary citizens, entrusted with the burden of survival itself. Armies were not merely tools of conquest, they were symbols of unity, forged from countless worlds into a single, obedient force. Every legionnaire believed the same unspoken truth, that as long as they served faithfully, they were safe. That belief did not survive contact with reality. The first signs appeared as questions. Minor at first, easily dismissed. Veteran officers requested clarification on deployments that made no strategic sense. Entire fleets were reassigned without explanation, ordered to patrol regions that no longer existed on official charts. Casualty reports referenced engagements no one remembered fighting. When inquiries reached higher command, the responses were always the same: classified, need to know, trust the process. Doubt is contagious in armies. It spreads not through speeches, but through silence. Soldiers began to notice inconsistencies in the Imperium's narrative, gaps where entire campaigns should have been. Some had personal memories that no longer matched recorded history. Others returned from missions to discover that the worlds they had once defended were now listed as barren or erased. Loyalty wavered, not because they opposed the Imperium, but because they could no longer understand it. To the high councils, this was unacceptable. Armies were meant to enforce obedience, not question it. The very existence of doubt within the military represented a catastrophic risk. Soldiers had access to weapons, information, and each other. If uncertainty became shared understanding, the Imperium's control could fracture from within. And so, for the first time, the decision was made to apply superweapons not to civilian populations, but to the Imperium's own forces. There was no battlefield, no enemy fleets to engage. Entire armadas were neutralized mid-translation, their ships rendered inert before crews even realized something was wrong. Communication systems collapsed simultaneously across thousands of vessels. Life support failed in patterns too precise to be accidental. Some ships simply vanished, removed from existence without debris or trace, as if reality itself had rejected them. Ground forces fared no better. Training worlds went dark overnight. Garrisons reported unexplained neurological failures, soldiers losing the ability to coordinate, to remember commands, to recognize one another. Units that had fought together for decades dissolved into confusion and silence. In some cases, entire legions were declared, decommissioned, their service records sealed and their existence quietly deleted. The message was unmistakable. Service did not grant immunity. Loyalty was not a shield. The Imperium did not need traitors to justify annihilation, it needed only the possibility of dissent. Armies existed at the pleasure of the system, and when that system perceived risk, even its most devoted defenders were expendable. The psychological impact rippled outward. Remaining forces tightened discipline to a suffocating degree. Independent thought vanished from command structures. Officers learned that asking the wrong question could erase not just their career, but their entire unit. Fear replaced camaraderie. Obedience replaced honor. Yet the Imperium considered this a success. A military that never questions is a perfect instrument. One that understands it can be destroyed without ceremony is even better. From that point forward, soldiers fought not for ideals or survival, but because they knew the cost of hesitation. The Imperium had crossed another threshold. It had proven it was willing to kill not just its people, but the very hands that enforced its rule, without remorse, without acknowledgement, and without hesitation. What if guilt could be inherited, and punishment delivered before a crime was ever committed? As terrifying as the destruction of worlds and armies had been, the Imperium had still been reacting to something that already existed: cultures, doubts, questions, hesitation. But reaction implied risk, time, the possibility that instability might spread before it could be contained. For an empire obsessed with permanence, that margin of uncertainty was intolerable. So the Imperium went further. Deep within its sealed research strata, a new doctrine took shape, one that redefined responsibility itself. No longer would individuals be judged solely by actions or beliefs. Instead, they would be evaluated by probability. Statistical models, refined over centuries of surveillance and data collection, began to identify bloodlines with elevated chances of noncompliance. Patterns emerged across generations. Certain genetic clusters correlated with creativity, independence, resistance to authority, or unpredictable social behavior. To the Imperium, this was not prejudice. It was mathematics. The conclusion was chillingly simple. If rebellion could be predicted before birth, then rebellion could be prevented entirely. No uprisings, no martyrs, no costly interventions, just quiet, invisible correction at the source. The weapon developed for this purpose was among the most secretive ever conceived. It did not operate on planets or cities, but within the human genome itself. Delivered through controlled medical infrastructure, environmental exposure, and subtle alterations to reproductive systems, it targeted specific genetic markers deemed destabilizing. The affected populations were never informed. They did not need to be. At first, the changes were almost impossible to detect. Birth rates declined slightly among certain families. Miscarriages increased, but remained within plausible margins of natural variance. Children who were born alive often suffered unexplained failures, organs that never fully developed, immune systems that collapsed without cause. Doctors were confused. Researchers blamed environmental stress, diet, chance. The Imperium blamed nothing at all. Over time, entire bloodlines withered. Names disappeared from registries. Family trees ended quietly, without scandal or accusation. There were no trials, no condemnations, no public acknowledgement that these people had been judged unworthy of continuation. From the Imperium's perspective, justice had been served without cruelty. No one had been punished for a crime. They had simply been prevented from becoming a problem. What made this weapon uniquely horrifying was its permanence. A world could be destroyed and remembered. A population could be mind-broken and still exist. But a bloodline erased before it fully manifested left no echo. There were no survivors to mourn, no cultures to study, no histories to suppress. Potential itself was annihilated. In some regions, the effects compounded over generations. Societies grew increasingly uniform, increasingly predictable. Innovation slowed, art became repetitive, philosophical inquiry stagnated. These outcomes were noted, but tolerated. To the Imperium, stagnation was preferable to instability. A future without surprises was the safest future of all. Yet even this was not enough. The data revealed an uncomfortable truth. Humanity's capacity for divergence could not be fully eliminated. New anomalies always emerged. Random mutations, unforeseen social dynamics. The Imperium could prune, but it could never achieve absolute control. There would always be variables beyond prediction. And that realization led to the most dangerous question the Imperium had ever asked itself. If humanity could never be made perfectly obedient, then how much of humanity was truly necessary? The answer would reshape the Imperium forever. What if the Imperium's greatest enemy was not rebellion, but the idea that humanity might survive without it? By the time the Imperium confronted this question, it no longer resembled a civilization defending itself against chaos. It had become a system defending its own inevitability. The superweapons were no longer emergency measures or hidden safeguards, they were expressions of philosophy. Each deployment reflected a single, unyielding belief: the Imperium must endure, even if humanity did not remain fully human in the process. Deep within the highest levels of authority, a truth was finally acknowledged, though never recorded. Absolute control was impossible. No amount of surveillance, genetic pruning, or psychological restructuring could eliminate uncertainty entirely. As long as humans thought, remembered, and connected with one another, deviation would re-emerge. The Imperium could suppress it, delay it, even erase it locally, but never permanently. This realization did not lead to restraint. It led to escalation. If dissent could not be eliminated, then it would be preempted on a scale so vast that recovery itself became impossible. The Imperium began to think not in terms of worlds or populations, but regions, entire sectors whose long-term projections suggested unacceptable variance. Billions of loyal citizens lived in these regions. Productive, obedient, unremarkable. Their flaw was not what they had done, but what they might one day become together. Collective awakening terrified the Imperium more than rebellion ever had. A single uprising could be crushed. A shared realization, that the Imperium was neither eternal nor necessary, could not. Ideas moved faster than fleets. Memory outlived destruction. As long as enough people remained to remember alternatives, the Imperium's legitimacy would always be fragile. So the criteria shifted again. No longer was noncompliance required. No longer even probability. Now, the Imperium acted on potential convergence. Regions where cultures, trade networks, and communication density might someday allow independent identity to form were flagged as existential risks. Not because they opposed the Imperium, but because they could imagine existing without it. The weapon designed for this purpose dwarfed all others. It was not aimed at planets, minds, armies, or bloodlines. It targeted the framework that allowed civilizations to persist at all: infrastructure, continuity, and shared reality. Its function was simple in concept and apocalyptic in execution: to sever regions of space so completely that coordinated human existence within them collapsed beyond recovery. When the order was given, there was no countdown. Navigation failed first. Entire sectors lost reliable transit as spacetime itself became unstable, routes folding inward or collapsing into inaccessible dead zones. Communication followed, fragmented and distorted until messages arrived centuries late or not at all. Supply chains disintegrated. Worlds that had depended on one another for survival were suddenly isolated, forced into regression overnight. Then came the final phase. Stars destabilized, not explosively. There were no dramatic supernovae to mark the event, but subtly, fatally. Energy outputs fluctuated just enough to disrupt habitable zones. Crops failed. Ecosystems collapsed. Civilizations that had thrived for millennia began to starve, not because they were attacked, but because reality itself had been quietly adjusted against them. There was no single moment of annihilation. No clear line between before and after. Instead, there was decay. Confusion. A slow, grinding extinction that left survivors too scattered and desperate to understand what had been done to them. From the Imperium's perspective, this was ideal. No enemy to fight, no atrocity to point to. Just the natural consequences of an unfortunate region deemed unsustainable. Officially, the Imperium mourned the loss of contact. Exploratory fleets were dispatched, never to return. Reports cited cosmic instability, unpredictable phenomena, unavoidable tragedy. The narrative held because there was no evidence to contradict it. The regions were gone, not destroyed, but functionally erased from the human future. With that act, the Imperium achieved something it had never managed before. It did not merely kill its own people. It removed the possibility that they could ever matter again. And yet, even as silence spread across the void, a deeper unease took hold within the Imperium itself. Because for the first time, it had used its greatest weapon not against rebellion, not against probability, but against potential. And potential, once defined as an enemy, has no limit. The Imperium had ensured its survival. But it had also proven something far more dangerous, that nothing, not even humanity as a whole, was beyond acceptable sacrifice. What do you do when even erasure is no longer enough? For a time, the Imperium believed it had solved the problem of humanity. Entire sectors had fallen silent, not with screams, but with the quiet finality of abandonment. Records were sealed, projections stabilized, the system endured. From the outside, the Imperium appeared stronger than ever, leaner, quieter, more efficient. Fewer variables meant fewer crises. Fewer voices meant fewer questions. And yet, something began to go wrong. It started as an anomaly buried deep within predictive models. A statistical echo that should not have existed. Despite the destruction of worlds, the collapse of regions, the pruning of bloodlines, resistance patterns were re-emerging. Not rebellions, nothing so obvious, but alignment. Correlations between distant populations that had never interacted. Similar myths forming independently. Identical questions surfacing in cultures separated by vast distances and centuries of imperial conditioning. The Imperium's analysts were unsettled. These were not inherited ideas. They were not transmitted through communication networks or shared history. They appeared spontaneously, as if humanity itself were attempting to remember something it had been forced to forget. Concepts of autonomy, stories of ancient freedoms, symbols that had no official meaning, yet provoked unease in imperial overseers who encountered them. The conclusion was terrifying. The Imperium could erase worlds. It could silence minds. It could extinguish futures. But it could not fully destroy the underlying human impulse to question, to connect, to imagine alternatives. Suppress it long enough, and it would reassemble itself in new forms. Not because of organization, but because it was intrinsic. To the Imperium, this meant only one thing. The problem was not dissent. The problem was humanity itself. This realization fractured the final restraint within the highest councils. Until now, every atrocity had been justified as preservation, of order, of survival, of civilization. But now the calculus shifted. If humanity could never be made safe for the Imperium, then the Imperium would redefine what humanity was allowed to be. The final weapon was not conceived as a weapon at all. It was framed as an adjustment. Unlike previous superweapons, it did not act on specific targets. It did not require identification of threats or probabilities. Instead, it altered the baseline conditions of existence across imperial space. Subtle changes to physics, perception, and cognition, small enough to escape immediate notice, vast enough to reshape civilization over generations. Creativity declined first, not erased, but blunted. Original thought became exhausting, then rare. Artistic expression persisted, but recycled itself endlessly, drawing from approved templates and sanctioned histories. Philosophy narrowed. Moral inquiry collapsed into obedience framed as virtue. Then came the change in memory. Not memory of events that had already been damaged, but memory of possibility. The ability to imagine a world meaningfully different from the present began to fade. Citizens could complain, could suffer, could even resent the Imperium, but they could no longer conceive of life without it. The concept itself became abstract, unreal, almost absurd. This was the Imperium's masterpiece. A civilization that could feel pain, but not envision escape. A population that could recognize injustice, but not believe in alternatives. Rebellion without hope is not rebellion at all, it is noise. And noise can be ignored. From an administrative perspective, stability reached unprecedented levels. Uprisings vanished almost entirely. Even when systems failed, citizens adapted rather than resisted. The Imperium no longer needed to erase worlds or collapse sectors. Control had become ambient, woven into the structure of thought itself. But there was a cost the Imperium did not anticipate. As humanity diminished, so did the Imperium's purpose. An empire that exists to control a people eventually discovers that control is meaningless without something vibrant to suppress. Innovation slowed to stagnation. Expansion became ceremonial. Survival was achieved, but at the expense of growth, curiosity, and ambition. The Imperium endured, but it no longer lived. And somewhere within its vast, silent archives lay a final contingency. A protocol so extreme it had never been authorized, only preserved. A solution to be enacted only if all others failed. A weapon designed not to control humanity, but to end the question of humanity altogether. The Imperium had built it in secret, centuries earlier, convinced it would never be necessary. Now, for the first time, the councils began to wonder if the Imperium itself had become the anomaly. And if so, whether it, too, would need to be erased. What happens when the masters of destruction turn their greatest weapon upon themselves? The Imperium had always feared rebellion, dissent, and deviation. It had perfected the art of annihilating worlds, erasing memories, pruning bloodlines, and neutralizing armies. Yet in its endless quest to preserve order, it had overlooked the simplest truth: power is fragile, even when absolute. Systems decay, leaders falter, and the instruments of control can become a threat if left unchecked. The Imperium, in its infinite foresight, had built a failsafe, but a failsafe is still a weapon, and weapons do not obey morality. The contingency was known only to a handful of shadowed councils. It was called the Final Convergence, a sequence capable of collapsing regions of space, destabilizing planetary cores, severing interstellar communication, and rewriting reality itself. Unlike other superweapons, it required no enemy, no rebellion, no excuse. Its activation criteria were simple. If the Imperium itself ceased to justify existence in the eyes of those who ruled it, the Final Convergence could erase it completely. Not just its people, but its very structure, the fleets, archives, and machinery of governance, folded into impossibility. The weapon had never been deployed. It was a failsafe, a last resort for a civilization that had already erased billions of lives without hesitation. Its designers had believed it would remain theoretical, a tool of deterrence rather than execution. They were wrong. Over centuries, the Imperium's own reach had extended so far that anomalies multiplied. Even with every precaution, it was impossible to monitor every sector perfectly. Potential convergence of independent thought, accidental synchrony of memory, and statistical flukes in human behavior had created a situation the Imperium could not ignore. And so, the Council convened in silence, staring at projections that showed future instability on a scale larger than any single deployment could contain. For the first time, the rulers of the Imperium faced the ultimate question: how do you protect an empire from itself? The answer was horrifyingly simple. The Final Convergence was activated. At first, nothing seemed different. Systems hummed as usual, stars continued their rotations, ships transmitted their reports, yet subtle distortions rippled through space. Navigation grids faltered, communication signals warped and fractured. Infrastructure that had seemed permanent grew unreliable. Worlds that had relied on interconnected networks began to collapse into isolation. Supply lines broke without explanation. Entire regions, previously stable, became uninhabitable, not destroyed in the dramatic firestorms of earlier weapons, but erased from coordination, memory, and function. Fleets attempting to respond vanished as if the paths they traveled had been removed from spacetime itself. Cities did not burn, they simply ceased to operate. Industry stopped, governance froze, and populations were rendered inert in the face of incomprehensible entropy. The Imperium had built a weapon to eliminate potential rebellion, but now, it was dissolving its own machinery, its own bureaucracies, its own structures of control. Panic was impossible to measure. There were no alerts to sound, no propaganda to issue, no archives left intact to record failure. The system simply folded, and those who might have understood were already gone or neutralized. Even the high councils that had authorized the activation watched, powerless, as their world-altering decision consumed itself. The empire they had believed indestructible was disappearing, not violently, not with spectacle, but with the quiet inevitability of a star collapsing under its own gravity. In that moment, the Imperium discovered its final lesson: there is no authority so absolute that it can contain the consequences of its own power indefinitely. Weapons may annihilate enemies, silence populations, and even erase generations, but they cannot preserve control forever. The act of wielding total power contains within it the seed of collapse. And as the stars dimmed across the sectors the Final Convergence touched, one truth became clear: the Imperium, the civilization that had mastered death on a galactic scale, was finally confronting the one force it had never fully understood, its own inevitability. Silence followed, not the silence of obedience, not the silence of fear, but the silence of an empire that had erased itself from the map, leaving only the echo of power without purpose, a testament to the terrifying, unsparing logic that had governed it for millennia. And so, the Imperium learned the final truth, too late. After millennia of shaping, pruning, erasing, and remaking humanity in the image of obedience, it had become clear that survival without meaning is not life. Billions had perished, worlds had vanished, bloodlines had been snuffed out before birth, and minds had been hollowed to remove the capacity for thought beyond compliance. Yet even all of this had not been enough to secure perfection. Potential could not be fully destroyed. Ideas, in some fragmentary, unpredictable way, always found a way to flicker back into existence. The final convergence had been unleashed, a weapon capable of unmaking everything. The fleets, the archives, the systems of governance, all began to dissolve into nothingness. Entire sectors fell silent, not with fireworks of war, but with the eerie stillness of inevitability. And in that silence, the Imperium itself became a victim of the logic it had wielded so ruthlessly. It had attempted to control the uncontrollable, to annihilate all uncertainty, and in doing so, it proved that absolute power carries within it the seed of its own demise. Yet even in extinction, a fragment of the Imperium's work remained. The silence was not total. Somewhere, scattered across the void, small sparks of memory, curiosity, and thought persisted. They were faint, fragile, incomplete, children of erased worlds, survivors of forgotten bloodlines, echoes of ideas that had been deemed too dangerous to exist. These remnants were not powerful enough to resist annihilation, yet they could remember. They could imagine, and perhaps, long after the Imperium itself had vanished, they could rebuild. The empire that had feared humanity's potential above all else was gone. Its weapons, its fleets, its armies, even its doctrines, all erased, folded into history as if they had never been. But the lesson it left behind endured in silence. Control is never absolute. Fear is never perfect, and the desire to live, to think, to be free, cannot be extinguished, not even by the most brutal superweapons. And so, the galaxy remained. Quiet, scarred, and empty in places, but alive in others, carrying forward the faint, stubborn pulse of what the Imperium had tried so desperately to destroy. If the Imperium had learned anything, it was too late to matter. Power is fleeting, but life always finds a way to remember.